All right, so I work at WibiData, and I lead the infrastructure operations team. I've used Puppet for, well, basically since 2009. And this talk really was motivated around sort of users who started with Puppet and got that first module, and then were super excited by how much work it saved them or how fast they could do it, and then got to that second or third or fourth and realized there's a whole new class of problems. So, but before I do that, I love my employer. I work for Wibi. Wibi does big data applications, because why not? So what we do is we enable our customers to take data that they have about their customers and reason about it in like a demographic way or an entity way, and sort of make presentations to them. So, Netflix, Amazon, these sorts of things. We're an open source company, so the open source side of our world is called Kiji. If you care about things like Hadoop and HBase and writing applications on top of those things, you should check it out. And that really sort of centered my world. So the thing that I do every day is I deploy Hadoop clusters, right? And Puppet is a big part of that for me. But in the very beginning, as most, or not most, but many stories that involve pain in this world, they all begin with sudo. Fun fact, there are 13 sudo modules in the Puppet Forge right now. I just checked. And they are all wildly different. So I'm a new Puppet user, right? And I want to run this thing called Razor because someone said it was really cool. And I pull it in, and it has all these dependencies. I have no idea what these things do, but Razor says it wants them, so why not? At the very bottom, it pulls in a sudo. Great, that's fine. Sure, let's go. So get Razor up and running. Happy, yes, I'm provisioning machines. It's wonderful. I want to monitor those things, so I'm going to do a Chinga, and I'm going to pull in some NERPy, and I'm going to do that off a module. Why did this die? Oh, so I grabbed a module that relies on a totally different sudo. Well, I mean, how bad can it be, right? It's sudo. So this is the first sudo, and you give it a file or you give it a string, and that's easy enough. How bad is it? Yeah, that's not at all the same, right? So now I have a couple options. I can just say screw it and fork it. I can try to figure out some other workaround, but in the end, welcome to the door to hell. This is always going to happen. And by the way, this is actually a place called the door to hell. And much like module hell, this was actually man-made. So some petrochemical engineers lit a fire in the middle of a natural gas field. It blew up and created this. They thought, well, we'll just leave it, let it burn out. 40 years later, still going. So if you look at sort of things in Puppet that can sort of burn you, right? So modules is fairly high up there. And there's a lot of different parts of it. So the interfaces between modules, versions, I just sucked down this new version of a module. Oh, it's completely different now, I'm host. Does this module work on my operating system? Does this module work on the version of Puppet that I'm using, right? So if you went to Ryan's talk yesterday, you'll see that the Forge is really sort of taking this on. When I first started using Puppet, the Forge didn't exist. We had GitHub, and GitHub really wasn't modules that you used. It was reference implementations. Here's a way that you might write an Apache module. And so if you watch the community, we're really at that inflection point where there's a class of, when you say module hell, it sounds familiar, right? Module hell. Oh, jar hell, gem hell, DLL hell. This is not an unknown problem, right? This is well solved within software engineering. So, okay. The mantra is infrastructure is code. Check. There's a whole world of software engineering that we can wrap around that, and we don't have to be hardcore devs to do it, right? So there's techniques in source code management that will make this easier. There's techniques within verification and validation or QA testing that will make this easy. There are some release management processes that you can adopt that will make this easier. But the one that I care about most, and I save for the end so I can go over, is module as an API. So let's just start with source code management. Use it. I was talking to someone and just the other day, and they said, well, when I first started, I was on master in production, and I just started writing stuff. And then every once in a while, I'd like sync it over to SVN. Like, oh, yeah, don't do that. So you don't have to use Git, but you should use something. The community has sort of settled on Git, right? If you look at most modules live on GitHub. So even if you don't internally use Git, you're a perforce shop or whatever, maybe become familiar with these tools and what they can do for you. Simplify around modules, especially around the way that you source code contain modules. I'm going to tell you a piece of advice, and you're probably going to say that doesn't sound simple. Every module should have its own repo, and it should be totally separate. And you're like, well, I have like 80 modules. That's 80 repos. And the reason that I'm going to recommend this is if you think about it, your modules evolve in different rates, right? So you have some modules that evolve very, very quickly, and you have some modules that are static and they haven't changed in a year. If you have them all in one place, it becomes very difficult to release them in sort of a step way. Like, I need this version of this module to move forward, but everything else has to stay the same, and I want to do development, so I'm going to start doing some branches because that sounds like a good idea, and now I'm going to cherry pick things around because that never results in a problem. So just repo all of them, and then you can release them on themselves. So ode to Portland. There are some great handcrafted things, right? Handcrafted cup of coffee, wonderful. Handcrafted module path, not okay. So if you Puppet module and you use Puppet module to just check things out into your module path, and you just kind of create this over time and you just start putting modules in, what happens when your server dies? And now you have to go back and recreate that exact same module path. Well, I'm guaranteeing none of those modules are in the same place you thought they were. You don't have written down what modules or what versions you were running, and now you have implemented your own special version of hell. So use a tool, because you're doing repos per module, use a tool to help you put those together, right? I don't use any of these tools. At Cloudera, I wrote a tool called, or helped write a tool called Creepo. No one in this room should use Creepo. Don't look at it. It's on GitHub, but please don't go look at it. Use Librarian if you like Librarian. Use Librarian Simple if you would prefer that. So the difference here is there's no dependency resolution. There's dependency resolution up there. There's this relatively new one. I don't know much about it, but it's also from GitHub, so it could be good. And then R10K, sort of a Puppet Labs employee version. They all basically do similar things. There are nice features and sort of naughty features. The thing that matters to me, though, is I want to be able to track a module. And I want to be able to track the module at a hash or a branch or a tag. And I want that to be able to just work, right? So these things help you do that. So much like the guy who likes to edit his modules, or actually write his modules on master in production, some people that I've talked to actually pull brand new modules that they've never seen or used before straight into production. Don't do that either. Doing it live is just really not a great idea. Have an environment, so what Luke said, we should all break things, but in a controlled environment. This is my stack. There are many like it, but this is mine. I recommend this stack because I understand it very well. You might have something totally different. But in the end, what you want is you want the ability to spin up an environment, test something, make sure it works, and then promote it, just like you would anything else, right? You're not going to grab a new version of Tomcat and throw it into production just because. Like, things break that way. Oh, man, I'm flying. I'm not going to talk about testing too much, other than say you should do it. There are some other talks here. But when I talk about testing, there's two kinds. There's module testing with like RSpec Puppet, and then there's sort of just testing, so smoke or integration, sort of around the things that you're doing. So you are basically executing code as root that this person over here wrote. And so I trust Eric. He seems like a nice guy. I'm probably still going to review his module, right? And I'm probably still going to run it in a vagrant that's like walled off from the rest of the world in case he tries to take over my office. You know, these are things that you're going to want to do, and you're going to want to be able to do it very quickly because as you develop or as you iterate, you know, oh, I need the new version of standard lib. Is that going to bust me? Well, let's test it out. And if you can do that in an automated way so that you don't have to be in the middle of it, you can just kick off a Jenkins job and Jenkins comes back like it's going to bust you. Then you know, your life will be a lot easier. So let's talk a little bit about release management. This is an eye chart. I don't expect you to read it. Fun fact, this is the Hadoop versioning scheme. Up until like, well, there's CDH4 in there, and there's, you know, not quite Hadoop 2 and Hadoop 1. But you can kind of see, like, at the top, like, oh, yeah, it goes down, and I can see that there's versions, and then blah, something happens, and it just gets nuts, right? So this isn't very useful. It's very difficult to describe. Like, some of these versions are actually, like, co-linked to other versions. Like, how does that happen? This is not, like, modules. This is one thing. And it turns out there's lots of distributions of it. But what the community has kind of settled on is semantic versioning. So if you haven't heard about it, go here. I'll give you a little overview. Major version, minor version, patch. If you think about, so I'm going to take your code, and I'm going to trust that you know, you write good stuff, you test it, and that it's going to help me like do my job. And one of those things is sort of a social contract, right? So if you sign up to semantic versioning, the social contract is I version this way, and when you get a new release from me, you can see in the version how bad your life's going to be, right? So if I bump a major number, I can do whatever I want. You know, API stable or not, I can rip out classes, I can change interfaces. The world is my oyster, I can change anything. Minor version, you can add things, but you can't really subtract things. So you can add a new function. You could argue that you add a new parameter that has a default that you don't have to know about. I think that's kind of sketch because to me that changes an interface. But these are things that you can do. And then minor version, or patch version, sorry. You fixed a bug, right? You fixed a string, you fixed some documentation. There was, you know, Debian decided to change the package name, so you fixed that. And then this describes this contract. So if I'm using your version or your module and it's 1.0.1 and you release 1.0.2, I expect that I will have a very low friction upgrade to that. If what actually happened is you changed the whole thing and you ripped out interfaces and tore out classes, you sort of broke that contract with me, and now I really don't trust you because you burned me and my Friday night was shot, right? So I'm going to not use your module next time because I can't trust that you're going to not make my life hard, and I'm trying not to make my life hard. That's why I'm using Puppet. So you know, stick to this. There's an also sort of important part to this is that it's perfectly okay to go 1.0 at some point, right? So 1.0 has this connotation. It's API stable. I don't know if this is really the API. Well, how long have you been doing it? 9 months in production. I have like actual like business value derived from this. Really, 9 months in production. How much do you change it? Never. And it's 0.0.6. Like maybe we should make this 1.0. So you know, don't rush to get there. If the module is heavily in flux in your first time around writing it, then you know, yes, it still can be a 0 module. But if you look at the Forge, about half of them that are used frequently, and by frequently I mean all the time by everybody, including a sudo module, are still in the zeros, right? So it's okay. Like just go 1.0. If you end up on 9 sometime from now, no one's going to judge. So infrastructure as code, and my favorite part. A long time ago, I was a C++ developer, and I've forgotten everything that I ever knew about C++, with the exception of a handful of things about header files and interfaces. And so the things that I care about most around, or that spin me up the most around Puppet, are around sort of interfaces. There doesn't need to be 13 sudo modules. There doesn't need to be 50 Apache modules. As a whole, we bike shed a lot, so okay, maybe there's 4 or 5, 6, 7, maybe, right? Because I'm not convinced that I could get everyone in this room to sit down and agree with me what an Apache interface looks like. But I do think I could probably get everyone in this room to sit down and kind of camp up into maybe 3 or 4 camps that can agree, right? And so then that's sort of what I'm hoping ends up happening. So modules are APIs. And what are APIs? Well, they're easy to learn. And they might be easy to learn because they're simple. So things that make a Puppet module simple is I need to touch it in as few places as possible, right? So for me to use your module, maybe I just include or instantiate one class. Maybe there are a handful of parameters within that I instantiate. If I have to know that I pull in this params and then that config and this service and that thing, and I have to wire them up because I'm going to anchor on both sides, and I have to do that, it's not easy to learn, and it's certainly not easy to use, right? So the flip to that is that it should be hard to misuse. The thing in Puppet that I misuse the most, or I used to misuse the most, is defines, because I would use defines as loops. Turns out you can hand define an array, and you can just basically loop through it. So that's how I would loop. That's easy to misuse. You should strive for your modules to be hard to misuse. So sane defaults, right? If you have some parameters that are, you require, you should have defaults for them so that if I don't want to and I just say class NTP, it just works, right? Because there's servers already behind it. And the last thing is sort of easy to extend. And for me, in a Puppet module, like maybe you have some defines in there, some types or whatnot, but it's not so much about actually adding more classes. It's about using it in an extensible way. So I have an example towards the end that really talks to this, but if you hard code in your monitoring system into your module, it's no longer easy to extend for me, right? I actually now have to fork it. I have to rip all your monitoring out because I'm probably going to guarantee we don't do monitoring the same way. And now, I basically have to go back and write all over again. So when you're getting ready to write a module, sit down, take a breath, and before you start typing curly braces, gather some requirements, gather the use cases. And I think one of the problems with module writing is that you look at it, and you look at an Apache module, and you want to boil the ocean. You want this to be the most perfect Apache module of all time, the single most encompassing Apache module that anyone will ever need, and that's impossible to build. So for whatever your application is, find the use cases or the corner cases or the edge cases that specifically address your requirement, right? And just write that. Don't specify passenger and other parts, even if you don't, especially if you don't use them, right? So it doesn't have to be this super module. If you just have a very simple module that does one thing and does it very well, and you put it on the forge, people will use it. Because you're probably not the only person that runs Jira or whatever. And then private is possible. So there's not really a notion of private in Puppet. Totally, Puppet people, notation, some way that I can make stuff, I can make implementation details private so people can't use them, or at least get warnings about you're not doing something you should be, right? That'd be awesome. I can put that in documentation, but documentation can be ignored. But some of my modules have 30 classes, but you as a user would only touch 2. Document all the things. I like to think that this guy is happy because he's not the module writer. He's the module consumer, right? and there's a ton of documentation for him to understand what's going on. The module writer is definitely not laid back and happy about this much documentation. But the thing is, really, it is super important, especially around public modules, or even in your own company, right? Like, you might not be there in 6 months. You might go win the lottery and live on a beach. It'd be awesome. But somebody else is going to inherit what you leave behind, right? So document all the things. And in Puppet, it's more than just like source code comments or structured documentation at the top of your module, right? READMEs, if you're actually going to go into the Puppet Forge, the actual module file which describes dependencies, right? These are all things you need to know. If you do have weird preconditions or things that need to happen, specify those. If you rely on a repository that's internal to you and no one else has it, and it's a custom version of Ganglia that you compiled and it only lives in one place, and you define that nowhere, that module is completely worthless for everybody else, right? So to the extent that you can document all the things that live in your modules, do that. So quick show of hands, who in here has ever written a typer provider? Oh, yes. If you think about types and providers, these are basically the best sort of way to head towards interfaces, right? So we can agree on what that looks like, and then if you want to implement the monet or the supervisor D or the whatever, we just go off and do that. So the downside is there's some more magic, right? It's not the DSL. Less friendly for newcomers. This is a great book. I recommend it. Or go to GitHub and look at examples. And this is one of my favorite examples. And when I don't understand what I'm doing, this is the example that I tend to look at, which is the Sensu types and providers. But not everyone's going to write types and providers. They are sort of heavyweight. Testing them is harder. So some people, in some of my friends and some people at Pinterest, we use what I'm going to call meet me modules. So if you've ever been to a meet me room, I have a network, you have a network, we're going to meet in a third party's location and actually join up. You can do this in Puppet. So I have this nifty application. This nifty application has a firewall. It needs some monitoring, and I want it to be supervised. I could hard code all of those things in, right? I could say, all right, here's my firewall rules, hard coded. I'm going to use a Chinga. I'm going to put that in there. Hard coded, I'm using monet. And all that stuff gets into this module, and it's all there. Nifty is no longer nifty for anybody else, right? At least no one else that doesn't use that exact stack, and potentially that exact stack in my environment. So instead what you do is Nifty has a firewall, and it instantiates a class called firewall nifty, and it passes a list of ports and protocols, everything that you would need to know to configure a firewall. Same thing with monitoring and supervising. And then just instantiates those classes. No one's written them yet, and if you try to compile this thing, it'll blow up and it'll be upset. Until you write this sort of module which wraps those, right? And sort of the genius here is if I hand this off to someone else, all they have to do to make it work for their environment, which is very different than mine, is write these same modules. This thing doesn't change at all, right? So we have agreed on interfaces because the nifty firewall specifies the things it's going to give you and how that's going to look. We can just pass this around. This module can go on the Forge. It's super reusable. Awesome. There is some amount of downside to this. How many layers of abstraction can we get into something, right? So I'm abstracting the abstraction to my abstracted module, which abstracts my operating. This is not a long-term solution. So long-term solution is lighter weight types of providers or maybe some other language sort of features, or maybe we just agree on actual interfaces, or maybe there becomes an interface. I don't know. In the meanwhile, this actually solves a lot of hell. And the biggest hell that it solves is fork hell, where everybody has their own fork. Everyone's monitoring, or everyone has to basically keep that fork alive to keep their delicate snowflake environment unique to them, right? And this is the world that I'd like to start moving away from. And now we're sort of in Chad's pet peeves section of the talk. I'm not going to tell you how to write a module. There are other talks in this track. And actually, I should have put a disclaimer in the front. Your mileage may vary. I'm not a lawyer. Consult a tax advisor. People that are coming up next in the same track are probably going to say other things. And I say things like always and never, and it's never that black and white. This is the way I do it. The example 42 guys will tell you one repo, and I like tightly coupled stuff, right? And maybe they wouldn't use those exact words. That's just me projecting onto them. Sorry. But you know, in the long run, like you'll figure it out. We'll have camps. My camp will have the best food and beer. Don't specify all the things is, oh, they cut off the top, but you don't even need to see the top. You don't even need to see all of it. All you need to see is that there's a lot of it. This is a Apache module. It's defined for a vhost. There are 22 parameters that you can see, and there are 27 that you can't. Do not, please do not do this. That is way, way, way too many. Like beginning software, that functions shouldn't have maybe more than like 5 or 8 things. Like 49, definitely too many. And if you think about some of these things are like passenger. Well, this is the Apache module of all time, right? Let's see. There was another one in here that really, really just. This actually will create the document root for you. So it'll manage it. Why is that not somehow abstracted out of this, right? The thing, if you think about modules as APIs, this is an API that's nearly impossible to use. And you are such a delicate snowflake if you have to use this vhost, because this is the only thing you can ever use. And if, God forbid, any of these changes, if these defaults change or whatever, it's going to burn you. It's going to burn you hard. So the way that I look at it, and somebody will probably say something very different, if you are not making a decision at catalog compile time, it does not belong in a parameter list. There are things like partial templates or other ways to basically just take structured data and spit stuff out. Give your users other ways to sort of set up all the things that they need. My favorite example, again, you don't need to know what this is. If you do know what this is, you clearly run Hadoop. This is a configuration file from MapReduce. And they are notorious because, one, they're written in XML. 2, they generally have like 200 of these like name value parameters that just go down. You could make the worst module of all time if these were all parameters, right? You generally only need a handful of things, like where does my HDFS live? What hard drives are on this box that I care about? And past that, for this stuff, like this is what Hiera is like made for, right? So I live in the fubar cluster. Here are my MapRed options, and it goes on forever. Please spit that out to XML for me and drop it on disk. The things that this solves is it really sort of unclutters your interface. It, in my opinion, provides sort of a better user experience. The module is generally easier to use this way. And so I think this is the end of my talk. That's sort of my recommendations for getting around module hell. So I hope that did not sound negative. That was not at all my I have sort of a bend sometimes when I get going that I love Puppet, and I love modules, and I love that other people write modules for me because I'm lazy and I don't want to write them. especially modules that I'm not an expert in. So I'm not the world's greatest MySQL admin, right? And I don't really have a good grasp on a lot of things. But I'm an ops team of one, or I was up until Monday. You know, I have to run MySQL because I really don't know Postgres at all. And you know, whether or not I should aside, like to do my job, I just want someone to do that for me, right? So I can operate this thing, but I don't really want to write it. People have asked me in the past, like, how much of your job is Puppet versus everything else? I said, well, Puppet's actually like pretty much all my job because I deploy Hadoop clusters. The amount of time that I spend writing new Puppets is actually very small. And the smaller that is, the happier I'm going to be because I don't love writing tests and I don't love writing these things, but I need them to do my job, right? So that's sort of my opinion. If you guys have questions, I guess now would be a good time for questions.
So if I'm kind of told that I wrote for me and it does what I need to do, is there a good place, a good forum to put that up and say, hey guys, what do you think about this without actually really releasing it?
Sure. So the question was, if you have a module that you wrote, is there a good place to put it to kind of just get people to kind of give you some feedback on it? The answer is GitHub. You should just throw it on GitHub. Don't necessarily throw it on the Forge, but throw it on GitHub, hop in the IRC channel, and the vhost that I pointed out was actually somebody asked me to code review a module for them that they don't even work in my company, but I was like, yeah, sure, I love code reviews. They're my favorite things. You know, if you can guess my email, I will do a code review for your module. But yeah, just throw it on GitHub, and for sure somebody will, in the IRC, will be happy to give you plenty of opinions about how that module could be better.
The other thing was the Puppet users mailing list.
Oh yeah, Puppet users mailing list. Sure. All right, somebody else. There's got to be at least 2 questions. No, I'm instantiating the firewall nifty class. Oh, sorry. Right. So the question was, in the meet me pattern, how does it actually work in like nifty firewall? And the answer is nifty firewall instantiates lowercase c class of firewall nifty. And it passes through the parameters for that, or a hash. In the case of a firewall, it would probably be a hash of ports and protocols or whatever I need to tell, right? And then that's all that module does, and then that module is done. So by doing that, I have now specified for you the interface that I expect you to implement in firewall nifty, so that you can take that. You know what you're going to get as arguments because I'm telling you what that class instantiation looks like, and then you can hook that in to whatever firewall module you're using.
Is there any recommendation for naming of those classes, like naming schemes?
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of naming talks going on right now. So I don't have a link for it, but the example 42 guys are putting out their sort of actual like naming where parameters have a certain name, and they're trying to get people to agree, like, you know, if we want to ensure a service is running, what should that look like if we want a true or false for that. There's the style guide from Puppet, which I heard yesterday that they're going to be upgrading or updating. There's also a module guide that Puppet wrote. So then like this talk sort of started me in this direction, so I will also be basically putting out my personal opinions. If I to give you like my 10-second spiel, use real words. Like privs is not what I would like to see if you wanted to wrap sudo, right? You know, just make it read like English, and that's really all I care about. Shorter is better. especially when you start to get these crazy like colon explosion things.
You mentioned using defines to like iterate.
Yeah. So loops and unicorns means I don't have to do that anymore.
What did I do that as well? So am I waiting for each in the
Yep.
upcoming, like,
Yeah. So
until then I just wait?
yes. Until each shows up. It is loops and Puppet, whatever. You talked to Luke probably in 2009 about that. Would have had a very interesting, maybe sort of hard conversation about trying to get those in right now. So now it's a lot better. So you are currently doing the best that you can on that. It is the root of all things evil because basically you're abusing the name var parameter in a way that but they let you. So ha. In terms of like my development box, I use the .puppet as part of my module path when I'm just messing around. On my production boxes, they all basically just go into my little creepo script just puts them all into modules. I'm sure someone somewhere has a good reason why that they don't do that. One of the reasons that, or one of the examples I meant to give about that checking in different versions, so having something that can abstract for you. When I worked at Cloudera, we had environments for engineering, support, and QA, which were all very different. And we had manifests that described those environments. And they all had different Puppet masters, and they were like actually on physically isolated networks, and because engineering blew up stuff. And turns out when support is like supporting the customer and things blow up, they don't like it. So that's really all the enforcement that I do. Someone here probably does something different.
So a question. I'm wondering if there's an easy way, or if not easy, what's the process for working out a dependency, and it maybe like a deep-rooted dependency.
Sure.
And here's my case used. I think it was PuppetDB that went in and insisted on firewall, the Puppet Lab firewall. I later tried to put something else in there and got all the red screen you got that said something else is trying to put firewall in there that conflicts with Puppet Lab's firewall.
Right.
And it's like, at that point, all bets are off unless you really, and Puppet Lab's firewall is not an easy creature to work with.
Sure. So the question is, if you do run into these dependency problems, what's a good way to sort of like drill down onto where they're coming from, right? So unfortunately, I'm not going to go to the module meetup jam thing where we get to tell Ryan what we want, because I've got a long list. But I'm going on vacation in like an hour. One of the things that I would like is the Forge to actually solve that problem, right? Like the Forge should know or should be able to help you drill that down. Like, show me. I use SAS sudo. Show me like everything that it pulls in or everything that pulls in it, so that I can like basically forward and backtrack this. There isn't really a great. I think even in the module tool, there's not a whole lot of this particular thing blew you up. So it is sort of kind of hand-tracked. Go to the module file, look at the dependencies. Certainly within resolution of like this thing requires standard lib, this version and this version like 0.1 higher. Like that part's still sort of manual. I think that you'll see a lot more tools coming out that sort of address that.
At this point, there's no other way other than nitpicking.
Yeah, this is probably true.
That I've actually had that particular problem myself. So I don't use the module for the download stuff because it'll pull in shit. But that particular module itself has you can tell it's not managed firewall.
Yeah.
So if you're designing something with an external dependency like that, and you're also publishing it, I have, in my modules, I have overrides for sysadmins, and it's like, they don't necessarily want to manage some part of my role. They just want to like tinker with it. So I have an override flag that says don't actually be part of the job.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it. I'll hang around for a little bit if anyone wants to ask me more questions. Otherwise, enjoy lunch.